thank you to everybody for joining us today for our iNaturalist webinar for National Moth Week. So right off the bat, this webinar and others we've delivered are recorded. They can be found on CWF's website, and I'll put a link to that in the chat a little bit later on while we're undergoing with the discussion topic. You can also just Google CWF webinars and you'll be able to see them that way. I would like to begin by acknowledging with immense gratitude that the land on which the Canadian Wildlife Federation is located and where I also live, work, and play is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin people have inhabited and cared for these lands long before today, long before we've been here, and just want to make sure we take this time to be grateful for the care and show our gratitude and respect to them and to the land for all that it provides us. I'm James Page. I'm a Species at Risk and Biodiversity Specialist here at CWF. I also have a hand in helping to manage iNaturalist Canada across the country, along with our partners at Parks Canada and NatureServe Canada. We also have with us Alicia Manso, who works with us here at CWF and as the iNaturalist coordinator. She's originally from Brampton, Ontario, and she's spent the last 6 years here in Ottawa, completing both her master's and PhD in biology at Carleton University. Along biodiversity, conservation, and shoreline erosion are some of her passions and what she's been focusing on with her PhD. Our primary speaker as well, Alicia Penny, is an avid naturalist, and she's our moth expert here. She's also a moth enthusiast who works at a biology lab instructor at Cape Breton University in Nova Scotia. She got hooked on moths in 2012 on a nice warm summer day after observing a strange sparkly orange bug in her car, not knowing quite what it was at the time. And after investigation, shocked to discover it was a moth, Linnaeus' spangleling, which is a nice, pretty moth. And from that point on, Alicia has always kept an eye out for moths and often overlooked creature. And she's documented over 5,200 observations on iNaturalist of nearly 600 species, and also has hosted an annual moth party at her home for the last 5 years as part of National Moth Week. So happy to hear all about that. So for our folks here on Zoom, if those that aren't, I'm sure everybody's familiar with Zoom at this point, we're going to use the chat for technical issues. If you have problems hearing for the audio or any questions for the panelists and presenters for more of the technical side of things, or if for some reason you do get cut off, please rejoin just using that same link if for whatever reason. And also that will also help if you sometimes have technical issues, just leaving and rejoining will often fix that. We're going to use the Q&A for the questions, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. So you can write in your questions throughout. I'll be tallying them and we'll pose them at the end. But as they come up in your heads, feel free to write them in there, and then we'll compile them at the end and pose those to Alicia at the end. For those who are hearing impaired, there's a live transcription option that you can click on at the bottom and click the option to show subtitles. So you'll be able to get a transcript as we go. So real quickly, CWF, we are one of Canada's largest conservation organizations with projects in conservation and research across the country, with some of our key focuses that you can see here on the screen. Our mission is to conserve and inspire the conservation of Canada's wildlife and habitats for the use and enjoyment of all. And we do this a number of ways, quite a few ways. One is engaging the public and youth in citizen science and education programs like the Wild Outside and the Canadian Conservation Corps, and then specific projects in freshwater, marine, and terrestrial environment. As I mentioned, CWF is also the lead organization behind iNaturalist in Canada, along with our partners at Parks Canada and NatureServe Canada. And with that, I will turn it over to Acacia to talk real quick, or a little bit about the iNaturalist platform and how to contribute.
Thanks, James. So today we're really excited to listen to Alicia's talk. So after you listen to her talk, if you're wondering about ways in which you can do more for moth conservation, a simple way is to upload photos using iNaturalist. So again, It's a very simple way. You can upload photos through the app or online at iNaturalist.ca. And you don't need to limit yourself to just moths this week. You can put any living organism and flora fauna on iNaturalist.ca. And iNaturalist is really cool that it incorporates an image recognition software to help you identify the species. So if you're not confident in the species, but you really want to upload and make a difference, you can still go ahead. So it's really as simple as you can take a picture and you contribute to conservation. So you can access your camera roll and take a photo, and it automatically records the date and your location. The website allows you to drag and drop photos and add the observation. And again, the image recognition software in the app and the website provides you with suggestions as to what species it is. And there's a community of over 100,000 people who are here to help you identify your observations. And just a tip, the better the photo, the better the chances of it being ID'd. So to kind of help with this, CWF has created helpful resources like tips and tricks for different species, how-to guides, videos and tutorials, and webinars like this one. So there's more info on how it all works, and this can be found in the resource page in iNaturalist. And you can get that through the help or the about sections. And we actually have a how-to guide for moths and butterflies. So if you're out mothing and you really want to have this handy with you, it's available to print on iNaturalist. Again, as James mentioned, CWF runs iNaturalist Canada, but all of the observations made on iNaturalist Canada feed into the global network of the iNaturalist.org database. And this has over 160 million globally observations and 15 million observations here in Canada. And the data is searchable, downloadable by anyone, and specifically shared with organizations for conservation and research. So data from people who affiliate with iNaturalist Canada is more easily shared for conservation in Canada. So please just make sure you check your account settings to make sure that you're affiliated with iNaturalist Canada and not iNaturalist.org. And the content on iNaturalist Canada is catered to show you local species and connect you with people who are local. And the benefit is iNaturalist Canada is in French and English, and we also have lots of resources. So today we're here to talk about National Moth Week, and Alicia has created a project to collect all of your moth observations over the course of this week. You can join the project, but you don't have to at all. Like, all you need to do is record a moth using iNaturalist and it's automatically added to the project. However, joining the project is beneficial because you can check out the tally in real time, and it's a great way to see what others are contributing, maybe give a tally so far. So as you can see, Ontario right now is in the lead. So it's really great to kind of see what everybody's doing. You'll have to log into your account to make observations. And then if you want to, you can join the project. It is featured under the projects tab, so it's not hard to find. And there is a webinar and tutorial in the help section of iNaturalist.ca to walk you through how to add an observation if you haven't done so far. And in doing so, I am going to unmute myself and I'm going to allow Alicia now to kind of get into mothing.
All right. Happy National Moth Week, everybody. Thank you so much, Acacia and James, for that wonderful introduction. I'm just going to share my screen here, and hopefully that will work for us. And you will be able to see my presentation. Good. Oops. Not the beginning. All right, don't look. Okay. Okay, so this is an introduction to mothing. So a lot of people maybe haven't heard that term before, but it's something that us moth enthusiasts tend to refer to as a verb for looking at, observing, documenting moths. So my name is Alicia Penny. I am a laboratory instructor at Cape Breton University, as you heard before. Most of the images in this presentation are going to be just things that I took with my phone. So unless it's otherwise noted, it's probably a photo that I took. So first things first, I want to give you a little rundown of why this random person is talking to you about moths. So I grew up in Unama'ki, the traditional unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, which is also known as Cape Breton Island over here in Nova Scotia. As a child, I was always very interested in like nature and things like that. But for about 25 years, I spent my time trying to become a professional musician and eventually went back to school, took my Bachelor of Science. And while I was doing my Bachelor of Science, I did a little bit of research and I got to do some research on marine macroalgae, also known as seaweed, and Atlantic salmon, tracking them throughout the Bredor Lakes in Cape Breton. And then I went on to do my Master's of Environmental Studies at Dalhousie University, and that was on freshwater mussels and their effect on water quality. So you may be asking yourself, where are the bugs? There are no bugs. So I actually have just got into mothing kind of by accident. I'm really, really excited about iNaturalist. It's been a big part of my life for a while. I have about 22,500 observations so far. And I guess I'm fairly, you would consider me fairly avid in terms of both iNaturalist and mothing specifically. So as James mentioned where it started, I found this little weird bug on my car and it's furry, it's orange, it's about 1 centimeter long. I have never seen a single thing that looked like that before in my life. And I looked at it, I said, it's not a fly, it's not a beetle, what in the world? So I sent this to an entomologist friend of mine named Clayton Dorsey. He said, it's a moth. I don't know what kind of moth, but it's a moth. And even just that blew my mind. What? How can a moth look like this? I always thought moths were these gray or brown things that are fluttering around your porch light, and they're just drab and boring. And then here's this brightly colored, shiny, exciting looking tiny bug. So that, again, it used to be called Linnaeus's spangle wing. They've changed it to a less exciting name, the linden bark borer. But it was one of the observations I put on iNaturalist. And it was one of many to come. So now I have over 6,000 observations of moths and about over 600 species logged, most of them from my home or from other areas in Cape Breton. So you don't have to go far because moths are a very diverse group of organisms. So now that you know who I am, we're going to talk about National Moth Week. This is why we are here. So National Moth Week is an annual event. It was started in 2012, coincidentally, in New Jersey. And it has since grown to an international event that documents moths. I'm not affiliated with them. I'm just a fan. This happens about the 3rd week of July every year. And this is similar to kind of the Christmas bird count. It's a way for people around the globe to have a common time to observe moths and collect year after year, and we can observe things that are changing, things that are the same, and also of course get people invested and involved and excited about moths. So they have a lot of really awesome tips and tricks and information on their website. So if you visit nationalmothweek.org, you can learn all about that and how it started. So now that we know why we're here, what is a moth anyway? So a moth is an insect, of course. An insect has 6 legs, has wings, has antennae. Moths have, a head, a thorax, an abdomen. They have they have 2 pairs of wings. They have 4 wings and hind wings. Often you only see one of those pairs if they're folded up. But they're part of the order Lepidoptera. So Lepidoptera means scaly wing. So if you ever have seen those, gray or brown moths that are fluttering around your porch light and you happen to touch one, you get some dust on your hands, that's actually little tiny microscopic scales which cover the wings of these organisms. It's pretty cool for them because it is a defensive mechanism. So if you get stuck in a spider's web and you have all these little tiny scales that you can easily shed, you're much less likely to be retained in that spider's web. Furthermore, the scales give them their beautiful patterns and their cryptic coloration and their ability to kind of hide in plain sight. A lot of the moths that you'll see in this presentation are on a blue background because that's my house. So most of the moths are not blue, but if you imagine them sitting on a tree bark or something like that, you will see how wonderful their coloration can be. So moths are among the most successful groups of organisms in the world. There's estimated around 160,000 species worldwide. Many of them haven't been described yet. In Canada, there's a checklist that was, I think, updated in 2018. So we're up to around 5,500 species in Canada. In my province of Nova Scotia, that's around 2,000. So, I mean, that's a lot of options for someone who's interested in looking at moths. And they're quite variable and quite interesting group of organisms. Now, keep in mind throughout this presentation that with that many different species, there's going to be a lot of different life histories, behavior, strategies, and obviously what they look like is going to be really variable. So as with most things in biology, anything that you learn as a hard and fast rule, you're going to learn quickly that there is going to be some exceptions to each rule. So this is a moth. Moths are typically broken down into two groups by people who observe them. So we call them macro moths and the micro moths. These are not like a true distinction. They're kind of just, you know, the ones that tend to be big versus the ones that tend to be small. They're not necessarily cladistically related, but there's some small macros, there's some large micros, but in general, you'll hear mothers like describe them as either a macro moth or a micro moth. So some of the micro moths a little bit smaller, maybe a little bit harder to photograph because they're tiny, but they are also really interesting and cool and beautiful in their own right, in my opinion anyway. So what is not a moth? So the Papilionoidea, which is the group which we call butterflies. Now, I also am not a native Latin speaker, so you'll have to forgive my pronunciation for some of these groups. But the butterflies, we've all seen butterflies. We think of them as a really amazing and diverse group. They're actually just a subset of Lepidoptera within the moths. So if you look at the taxonomic family tree, the pink group there is like a little branch that branches off kind of in the middle of their evolution. And that had some adaptations that really worked for butterflies. We're going to talk about a few of them in a minute. But, you know, in my opinion, this kind of shows butterflies, they're just day-flying moths. I mean, come on, they're the winners for me. So differences between butterflies and moths. This is a question that comes up a lot. So there's a few kind of, you know, rules of thumb. So for their pupae, that is, of course, the third stage of an insect's life. It goes from egg to larva to pupa to adult. So their pupae, moths typically have like a silken kind of outer coating and the pupa is inside. This is sometimes wrapped up in leaves, whereas butterflies mostly have a chrysalis that kind of is not quite as fuzzy, dangles from a tree. We may have seen some of these before when we are going through elementary school. Of course, most moths are active at night and most butterflies are active in the day. Now, of course, there's exceptions to this rule. So we have quite a few moths that are crepuscular. So that means they're active in, you know, dawn and dusk kind of times. We also have some just straight up day flying moths. And that sometimes causes a little bit of confusion to people who are not fully familiar with them. And then, of course, their resting position. So moths typically tend to rest either with their wings straight flat out to the sides or maybe folded up on their back, whereas butterflies can often rest with their wings folded up above their back. Now we'll see, you can see a lot of times butterflies will, when they're basking in the sun, open up their wings, but it doesn't usually end up being quite as flat as the way most moths hold their wings. This one's probably has the most exceptions to the rule, and we'll see a few of them later. There's another type of difference between moths and butterflies in the way that their wings connect to each other, but that is something that I'm not really going to get into because most people, if you're not going to be looking at them with a dissecting microscope, you're not really going to look at that anyway. So my favorite rule of thumb is to look at the antennae. So butterflies, because of how they branched off of the family tree of the Lepidoptera, most of them have a similar antenna. So their antennas are going to be what is called clubbed. They have a thin filament with a little thickened part at the end, which is called the clubs, whereas moths have a huge variety of antenna. Some of them are sexually dimorphic, so the males will have different antennae than the female. You can have filiform, you can have comb-like, you can have feather-like antenna. So basically, if it has the clubbed antenna, you can probably assume it's a butterfly. And if it has anything else, you can probably assume it's going to be a moth. That's a pretty good rule of thumb. So why do I care about moths? Because they're such a huge group, they're so abundant, they're so diverse, they have a major part in a lot of food chains and ecosystems. So one major one is herbivory. So moths larvae are often associated with specific host plants. So we think of primarily most caterpillars as eating plants. Some of them are very, very specific and will only eat a certain type of plants. And this is every plant. So it goes from trees to shrubs to herbaceous plants as well. On the right hand, you can see that is cinnabar moth larvae. Those were actually introduced into North America to eat ragwort, which was considered to be a pernicious weed. And they are so specific to that plant that they would kind of stay on them. Of course, because of their herbivory, they have often found themselves being classified as agricultural pests. There have been many a war waged against moth larvae and butterfly larvae by people who are trying to produce food and other agricultural products. But this isn't the only part of the ecosystem that they take part in. So the reason why we can't just get rid of all the moths and the caterpillars that eat all of our tomatoes and things like that is because they are a huge part of the food chain. They are food for so many groups of organisms, all the way from other arthropods, like things like wasps and ants and bees and things like that, and all the way up to bats and birds. And this is both the adults and the larvae being part of the food chain. And because they're so abundant, they're a really important food source for a lot of these groups. Another thing that's been in the news a lot lately about moths is some invasive species. So you may have heard of the spongy moth and its invasion. It's a kind of a bit of a problem. It's really hard to get rid of because they lay so many eggs. So this is another reason why moths have been in the public eye recently. One thing that a lot of people don't think about when they think about moths is pollination. So there's been some studies that moths can be even more efficient pollinators than bees. So we love pollinators, right? So because most moths are, crepuscular or nocturnal, we don't really see them going about their work of pollinating. But some of these moths are very, very strong flyers, and they're actually hugely important to the plants that they pollinate. And finally, moths also can serve as bioindicators and teach us a lot of stuff about our environment and our impact on the environment. So if we observe assemblages of moths and we measure the species richness and the different species that are present and their abundance and their relative abundance, we can learn things about the environment. So because they are connected with these host plants, sometimes we can learn about, human impacts on the habitat. So a lot of them are associated with trees. So clear cutting or monoculturing, things like that can all have a really big effect on what moths are present and when and why. Of course, we know a lot of moths are attracted to light. So light pollution is a really big topic when we talk about nocturnal insects, because they need to be able to find each other. They need to be able to navigate. And sometimes, depending on our ways, we can interrupt that. Moths are typically attracted to specific wavelengths. So there are ways that we can abate that by, providing lighting that is not quite as appealing to moths. And then, of course, climate change is something we're always thinking about. So moths have, you know, they're affected by climate change themselves. Their food plants are affected by climate change. And then, of course, the things that prey on moths are also going to be affected by all of those changes. So it's really all a big web that is interconnected, and it's all going to be impacted together. So this is a lot of stuff that we can learn from moths. They're the best. Now that we know why moths are cool and we know about National Moth Week, we're going to talk about how you can see some moths. So the most common way that people tend to attract moths to look at is by using light. So you can do active light trapping. And by active, I just mean you're out at night, you have a bright light shining somewhere, and you're looking at the moths as they are flying around going about their business. So a really common way to do that is to hang up a white sheet and shine a really bright light or a UV light onto it, and the moths will be attracted to that. And plus, the added benefit is that the sheet will give them a place to rest. And then once they're resting, you can take pictures of them. Another way is what I call passive observation. So this is you can make your own bucket trap. You can set it out at night, so you don't have to be, if you're not a night owl, you can just set it out and take a look at the moths in the morning. I'll show you some pictures of that on the next slide. And then, of course, you don't even need any of this fancy stuff like a sheet. You can just leave your porch light on, and you can do either thing. You can go out and look at them overnight, or you can leave the light on and look at them in the morning when they're kind of resting and dormant during the day. There's some other methods that are a little bit more for people who are a little bit more excited about finding as many species as they can. So not all moths are attracted to light. So one thing you can do is create some bait, and you can attract some other types of moths to your bait. And you can also go looking for caterpillars, which I'll just briefly mention in a moment. So bucket traps, like I said, these are my favorite thing, a way to observe moths. So they're really easy to make yourself. All you need is some kind of a container and a funnel and some kind of a light. So moths are going to go towards the light, they're going to get into the funnel, and then they're not going to be able to really find their way out. And then they just have to stay in there until the morning. So you're not actually harming the moths, you're just kind of making them late for work. But what you'd have is some egg cartons or some other kind of material inside where the moths can hide and rest overnight, and not feel, threatened. And then in the morning, when the moths are not active, you can just, take your time and take out the egg cartons and look at all the different species. So that picture up in the top with the egg carton, that is from my house on Saturday. We had a morning party for moths. And it's just a really great way it's good for children who can't stay up late. It's good for people who are maybe a little bit phobic of moving insects, to give people a chance to look at some really, sessile organisms and have the chance to really observe their beautiful patterns in beautiful lighting of day. So in terms of the lights that you can use for these, if you have access to, electricity, you can just plug it in and set it up by your house, or you can make portable ones. So the top left-hand corner, my friend Alan McMillan made this, just a flexible light strip with LEDs around an aluminum can. He runs that on a 12-volt battery, and that obviously worked to attract this Luna moth. The next image over is my light. So that's just a few LEDs that I ordered from the internet, and we rigged them up, and I run that on a 12-volt battery as well. So it can be as simple or as complicated as you want, and it can be as portable or as stationary as you need it to be. I did mention caterpillars and bait. So for caterpillars, you can basically go out in the daytime. Typically it's done by you put a little sheet under some branches of a bush or a tree, and then you hit the sticks. You use a stick to hit those branches, and caterpillars will kind of fall out onto your sheet, and then you can observe them there. That can be, again, you can use specialized equipment, or you can just go out with your own little piece of fabric and do it yourself. Bait is typically some sort of a fermented mixture. So a lot of people use mashed up bananas or, alcohol and yeast and things like that. They mix it all up. They have it sit out in the sun for a few weeks until it's really stinky. And then you can either soak like fabric or yarn in it and hang that up, or you can paint it right onto a surface. And you will find that you will observe different types of species at your bait than you might observe coming to your lights, which is a really cool way to do it. Then once we have the moths, let's talk about how to get really great observations for iNaturalist. So, really important, you want the entire moth in the frame. They do have cute little fuzzy faces, but you almost can never identify a moth based on its adorable little face alone. So you want to get the whole moth in frame with the wing patterns. Most of the time, a dorsal view is all you need. There are a few species where you might need, a side view or a ventral view of the belly of the moth, but most of the times the dorsal view is fine. Don't be afraid to get close to them. Moths in North America are not going to harm you, I will say. Take your time, make sure your photos are focused, and lighting is important. So that's one reason why I like to do mothing in the day. But if you're mothing at night, you can make sure you have a headlamp or a flashlight or something. Take your time to get the lighting right, so you're not getting like a really strange color cast to your image, because that can kind of throw the algorithm off. I also recommend cropping and rotating your images. Everybody doesn't have to do this, but I just find it makes it easier when people are looking at them to kind of see the important features without having to reorient themselves. And then lastly, don't get discouraged if you're not able to get your identification all the way down to species. There are a large number of moths which you might be able to get them to genus, but to get them all the way down to species would require dissection. So I'm assuming most of the general audience here is not going to have access to a dissecting microscope. And you know what? That's all right. Knowing about moth genuses, genre is going to be more than enough for what we want to do during National Moth Week. And remember, a macro lens is not necessary. So my friend Walter up there, it's not a macro lens, but he's got a fancy old camera. I just use my cell phone. So all of the moth photos that I have in this presentation are just taken with my cell phone and just take my time. And a lot of times they come out great. And also remember, it doesn't always have to be a work of art. We're here to document species and contribute to scientific knowledge. So don't put too much pressure on yourself to make a work of art with your photography. Once you have your photos, you can look into identifying them if that's something you're interested in. So I have a little bit of an East Coast bias here because I'm in Nova Scotia. So my moth Bible is the Peterson Field Guide to Moths of Northeastern North America by Beadle and Leckie. That is a wonderful resource. Now remember, I said there's 5,500 species of moths in Canada. So obviously they're not all in there, but it's a really great place to start. There's a really great field guide to caterpillars of Eastern North America as well, which I also recommend. I'm not as familiar with the West Coast guide, so if anybody has any recommendations of good field guides for the West Coast, absolutely share that in the Q&A or the chat. I would really appreciate that as well. There's also a lot of really great online resources. So Moth Photographers Group is one of the most common ones that mothers use. They have a lot of plates with images. And as long as you're a little bit familiar with kind of what group you're looking at, you can go and you can flip through those images. You can see where they were observed, and there's often really, really great photos that you can really see all the features that you need to see. Bug guide, of course, you have a little bit of ability for people to, communicate about your images, and you can ask questions and things like that. So it's awesome. And of course, iNaturalist.ca is the absolute best. The algorithm is always improving. And as someone who does a lot of mothing, I can say it's pretty good at moths lately. Of course, there are some that are a little bit iffy, and it all depends on your photography, but it's a really great place to start. And if that is not giving you what you need, you also have access to a huge community of lepidopterists and hobbyists alike who are very, very knowledgeable and more than willing to share their expertise with you on iNaturalist. So finally, I'm going to just go I can't do this. I can't go through them minutely, but just very briefly, kind of some of the major groups and kind of how to, narrow things down. I really love this this feature in Beetle and Lecky. They have a little silhouette guide for the common moths in the back. So this sometimes you can just narrow it down to group just by seeing what the silhouette of the moth is. But I'm going to show you some of the silhouettes and then some of my photos as well. Maybe that will help. So micro moths, these are a little bit difficult to, there's a lot of them and there's many families. So I'm not going to break them all down by family, but there's a lot of kind of major groups here that are kind of easy to identify based on the shape. So these are some of the ones that I have observed. The top right corner, the T-shaped moth, those are known as plume moths. A lot of people see those and don't even realize they're moths. We have the slug moth in the bottom left. So their resting posture has their abdomen sticking up in the air. And they're really, really tiny. They're about a centimeter long. The grass veneers, the one in the middle that's kind of golden and white. They're kind of like their wings are rolled up when they're at rest. They're very, very narrow, like a little tube. And you can see how that would work for them to hide on a single blade of grass, perhaps. And then there's a lot of other little interesting shapes and ways of blending in. So once you get familiar with moths, you'll kind of be able to look at just the shape of one of them, and you'll be able to flip to the right part of your field guide, or you kind of know what you're looking at to start looking for a species ID. The noted on today are the prominents. These ones are pretty fun. They have a lot of interesting shapes, interesting colors. Their resting postures are pretty weird. A lot of them look like little twigs or sticks. And there's quite beautiful variation in these ones. Everybody is familiar with the Saturniidae, the giant silk moths, and also maybe people don't know the rosy maple moth is in this family as well. But these are everybody's favorite. They're really large, they're really gorgeous, and they have a really interesting life history. So they spend an entire summer as a caterpillar, a larva, and their whole job is just to eat, munch, 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 and they become incredibly large compared to where they started. They pupate over the winter, and then in the spring, they all emerge fairly close in time to each other. And the reason that's important is because as adults, they do not have working mouth parts. So their entire purpose, once they emerge as adults, is to find a mate, make some eggs, and further the species before they run out of steam, because they're just working on their reserves of fat that they gathered as caterpillars. So kind of a melancholy story where they only live as adults for about a week. And if you get to see some during that time, it's pretty special because it's a short window of time. Another really popular group, the Sphingidae. These are the sphinx moths, very bold, very beautiful, really big, really strong flyers. Of the moth pollinators, these are a really big group of pollinators. You can see in the bottom in the middle there, we have the hummingbird clear wings, which people really love. You get to see those a little bit more because they are active in the evenings. And if you have like a beautiful garden with some nectar-bearing flowers, you may see them in the evening and just feel very lucky. A large group that we have are the tiger moths, tussock moths, the underwing moths. Some of my favorite moths are in these groups. But you'll see like the tiger moths, they have stripes, they have patterns. They tend to have fuzzy little caterpillars, so you're probably really familiar with a lot of these caterpillars. The woolly bear type caterpillars, the brown and black ones as well. That's kind of one of the hallmarks of this group. And then we have also some of my favorites, like large ones, like on the top right, those are the zales. That one is called the horrid zale. If we have time at the end, I might give you a little talk about why it's called that. It's not actually horrible in any way. And then there are the underwings, which are really special as well, because often their forewings are very cryptic in coloration. They kind of look like, tree bark or something like that. And then if they're threatened, they can open that up and show a very bright flash of color on their hind wings. Pretty cool stuff. Really common group, the geometers. This might be some of the ones you're familiar with from your porch lights. So these often come to light. They have a lot of variation in their postures and in their wing shapes. And their colors. A lot of these ones pretend to be leaves or dried up leaves or fresh leaves. And they're really, really varied and really amazing. Their larvae tend to be in the group that we would think of as inchworms. So they are trying to disguise themselves as, little sticks or twigs. And then as you can see in the top right side, they sometimes will rest with their wings up like a butterfly. So they can trick you into thinking they're in the butterfly group as well. And then finally, this is probably the largest group, and it's quite varied, but they're called the Noctuidae. These are moths. Their common names include daggers, borers, loopers. You will kind of see some similarities. I find they look like they're wearing a fur coat and they have kind of a fuzzy kind of collar around them. And that's kind of one way that I can narrow them down. So you can kind of see that in this silhouette slide. But again, they're hugely variable. The time of year is really important. So there's different colors, there's different shapes. They will often have, a silhouette that's an unusual shape, and that is to break up like their silhouette against, the background of a tree bark or things like that. Their larvae are often known as armyworms or cutworms. And they're usually not super fuzzy, but there are a few exceptions. So the daggers are typically a little bit furry as well. So larvae is not really my area of expertise, but sometimes you can see some similarities that can help you to kind of narrow it down if you're looking at larvae. So that is it. This is a picture of my daughter, River, and she is well on her way to becoming a moth nerd like her mom. So thank you so much for your time and for listening and for hopefully getting excited about moths. And I can't wait to hear your questions.
Amazing. Thank you, Alicia. That was super interesting. And yeah, I've learned a whole bunch and I feel like I know a little bit about moths and yeah, really well spoken and excellent information. So we do have some
being a lab instructor because I have to explain things to
yeah,
students a lot. But not
definitely
about
shows
moths.
through. Yeah, no, it was great. Lots of great comments in the chat saying thanks and well explained. So I appreciate that. That's everybody's super happy with hearing all about moths. And we do have some questions coming in. One that I think I will start with kind of a bit of a general one for me and then lead into this one as well is when posting to iNaturalist, as you said, there's so many different genus or, what do we call it if we're not sure? If you try and put in something just as moths, it comes up as butterflies and moths. Is there something like more general that we could put it in as we narrow it down a little bit, or is it better just to leave it as butterflies and moths if we're really not sure?
I think if you're really not sure, butterflies and moths are probably the best idea because, like I said, the butterflies are just kind of like a weird offshoot in the middle of the moths. If you are interested in moths and you start taking photos, you'll quickly kind of get familiar with like the major groups. So you might be able to say this is a noctuid moth or this is a geometer moth. But up until that point, just butterflies and moths. I mean, they're probably going to be moths because there are way more moths than butterflies. So those of us who are interested may know what you're talking about.
Great. And as a word of, I guess, caution, iNaturalist's image recognition software is really good, but if you're not certain it's that species, you're better to err on the side of caution. So if you're not sure of the specific species, definitely trying to bump it up and just call it that genus, so that at least helps the researchers and the experts key in on it and kind of identify.
Absolutely.
So this,
I found in my mothing practice, when you do that, the algorithm will often give you a really great place to start, and it's really good to use it in concert with one of those other resources, so a field guide or something. So oftentimes the algorithm will give me a suggestion, and if I'm not familiar with what the moth is already, I will go to my field guide, I'll look it up and I'll say, that's not quite right, but maybe it's this other thing, or maybe I'll leave it at genus or something like that. So usually using them with something else is a good call.
thank you. And so this ties into the more specific question that was asked, is it's seeming like moths are taking a long time to get identified sometimes in iNaturalist. Now, is this because, well, I can think of a couple of reasons. Is it because they're really just difficult to identify? Is there a lack of experts to do this? Or is there better photos needed? Like, what do you have any tips for helping getting things identified?
So this is as varied a question as moths themselves. I think a lot of times, like if you take the time to get those really clear photos, that can help. Some groups of moths are just really tricky. There's some moths are basically the same every time. They always look like this. So if you see them, like the rosy maple, it might have different, pink and yellow coloration, but that pattern and those colors are always going to be the same. Whereas some moths are really, really variable. So it takes a while and you kind of need different levels of expertise to identify different species. So having really good photos helps. Having kind of an idea of where to place them to kind of attract the right like experts to your observations. I know there's a really great expert in Ontario on micro moths, Jason Dombrowski. So he has really been I've never met him in real life, but he pops up on my observations sometimes of my little moths that I have no idea about. It's just super, super appreciated. So really, yeah, just trying to get your best photos, I think, is probably the number one thing to do. And then if you have a little bit of familiarity, trying to at least slot them into the correct family or genus would be really helpful as well.
Great, thanks. Another question about lighting, and this is something I hadn't really thought about, is pointing out that moths are nocturnal, or most moths. So why are they attracted to light at nighttime? And
I was hoping
lead on to that is what lights are better? Do black lights in particular, or other wavelengths? Or someone noted that they're switched to LED lights and they're getting fewer moths around their house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, moths are fairly picky about their light. So UV, kind of the shorter wavelengths are typically better. There's some really good research online on like peer-reviewed research that you can look up that shows they've done lots of research about which wavelengths of light. So like 365 nanometers, that's in the black light spectrum. Really a good, if you have to pick one light strip, that's one. And they also tend to go for like green and blues kind of lights. So if you have like a warm type of LED that's more on the yellow end, the reddish end of the spectrum, that's not as attractive to moths. So that's actually not good to attract moths, but that can help when you're trying to mitigate the effects of light pollution. So if you make your street lights and your house lights kind of a yellower type of light, you're less likely to disturb the moths that are trying to go about their business. And then on those, sporadic occasions when you're trying to like photograph and document the moths, you can use some of that bluer light as well. In terms of why moths are attracted to light, a really great new
Well
paper just
prepared.
came out. So basically what this paper has been positing is that it's not that they're coming right towards light, it's that they typically orient their dorsal sides towards light. So if the moon is shining and they're orienting their back towards the moon, that helps them just fly in a straight line. However, a really bright light source, if they turn to put their back in between them and the light, what that ends up doing is causing them to go into like these spirals that kind of eventually lead them to bumping into your light. And the brighter the light, the stronger that effect is. So, of course, this is one paper, but hopefully this is a good explanation that we can build upon in future years. It's really cool.
Very cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question to put towards Acacia. You did answer this in the chat, but I think it'd be worth, or in the Q&A directly, but I think it'd be worth to mention this to everybody about whether internet is needed for using iNaturalist to posting observations for their moth observations and others.
Yeah, so you can use iNaturalist offline to take photos. However, the image software recognition program will not be available to you. So you can type in your best guess and it will still let you type that. You can leave it at the most basic level if you're super unsure. And you'll also need data or Wi-Fi to upload once you get home. So if you want, you can snap all the photos and leave them at a very basic genus. You can say like it was a plant, and when you get home you have access to that software again, and then you can upload fully.
Awesome, thanks. And for those that want to use a digital camera too, you can just go straight from your digital camera right onto the iNaturalist.ca website too and skip the app if you're more into that. A question back to moths, and this came up a couple of questions, is about the scales on their wings. Applied to moths and butterflies, obviously, I would assume. Does it harm them if we touch a moth and their scales come off on our hands is one? And then following on to that is, will they regrow if they do lose some of those scales?
Now, I'm not totally sure, but from my understanding, they don't regrow them. And basically, they can still fly without their scales, but it is definitely detrimental to them to lose their scales. So it's kind of like a last ditch effort if you get stuck in a spider web. But once you do like mothing for a little while, you'll notice you'll get individuals that are clearly worn, like older individuals that have lost some of their scales. They're still able to fly. They're still able to, go about their business, but they don't seem to get their scales back. So they're usually freshest when they first emerge from their pupa. And then over time, they kind of gradually lose their scales. And in terms of their individual behavior and how important that coloration or that those scales are for their individual life histories, I'm assuming that it's as varied as anything else that comes to moths. But
Great, thanks.
yeah.
Moving on to a different kind of focus is about attracting moths, but more on the making your gardens or home space more attractive to moths. Do you have any tips, ideas? Are there specific plants that you could think of or mention that might be able to attract moths?
Yeah, if you're looking for like those really flashy crepuscular sphinx moths, you can kind of plant anything that you would normally plant like for hummingbirds because they have a lot of overlap in their food sources. So like anything with like kind of a lot of nectar and a bell-shaped flower. I've seen them a lot at like honeysuckle vines, and obviously my lilac trees attract a lot of those types of moths. Now remember, there's a lot of moths that don't even eat as adults, so that will do nothing for them. But for the ones that do visit nectar flowers, Just, yeah, your typical nectar, of course, in any kind of landscaping and natural kind of setting, native flowers and stuff are going to be the best because that's what co-evolved with the moths in your area. But if you do have kind of ornamental flowers, sometimes they will be attracted to kind of the trumpet shaped ones and the nectar bearing ones.
Right. And in particular, I assume night scented flowers are probably also good.
So I'm not a botanist, so I'm not really sure.
Okay.
But like there are
I
some, like there is a moth that lives where I live called the primrose moth, and evening primrose will actually kind of close up in the day, and you can find them kind of like hiding out in there. So that's like a native plant that has a really beautiful moth that is associated with it too. And then of course, if you have a particular type of moth that you want, like say one of the big silk moths or something, they often have like host trees that they prefer. So if you live in an area with like, birch or something like that, you might be more likely to see like a big cecropia moth.
Nice, thanks. I was going to mention evening primrose, yeah, and I think that's one of the night scented ones that can attract moths for that reason. And also, I've heard kind of more the whiter, paler colored flowers, which are more noticeable in nighttime, right? They would be more, it will show up a little bit more than darker colors, is what I've heard.
That makes a lot of sense.
Um, okay. Another question maybe to clarify, I think that people might be curious about is about Arnie moths, or I think we hear more about their caterpillars. Are there some of them that are poisonous, that are not good to be handling?
Absolutely. In as far as I know, in Canada, there's no like really, really bad venomous ones. I might be wrong. I know in the southern latitudes, there's some that are like really, really bad that if you touch them, there's like these saddleback caterpillars that can like cause a really bad reaction. Here there are some that are kind of the bristles are intentionally irritating. They do sometimes have a bit of venom in them that is supposed to irritate anything that's trying to eat it or come in contact with it or bother it in some way. And the main reason why you should avoid them is because some people have like allergic reactions and are more susceptible to get like dermatitis, like contact dermatitis from them. So I did show some photos of me holding the fuzzy caterpillars, but I have done that as a child and it never bothered me. So I never had any reaction. So I would just make sure to use caution if it's something you've never come in contact with. And of course, I really am more of an expert on the species that live in my area. So I could like, don't take what I'm saying as gospel if you live in a different location, for sure.
Amazing. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
There are still some other questions, but I think we're going to have to end it there. Some other, good questions as well, but a lot of great information in this, like the whole presentation. And, for anyone that might need a refresher, remember that the recording will be available. So you can, loop back and check out any part of that, especially I think those like ID parts of the different families. I'm for sure going to kind of check back on some of those when I'm looking at my moths and be like, okay, what family did Alicia say this might be in based on the shadow and the image? That's great. So yeah, thank you so much. I think a lot of people really enjoyed this, and as I said, amazing presentation, super well spoken, and on behalf of CWF and all the people attending here, thank you, Alicia and Acacia, for the iNaturalist portion and giving us a rundown on that.
Thank you so
And
much
with
for
that,
this opportunity, James and Acacia. This is definitely any day I get to talk about moths is a good day.
excellent. And remember, National Moth Week is still going on. So any of those of you who want to put this into practice, you can get out tonight and try and grab some photos. So have a great rest of your day, everyone, and thank you for participating.
Thank you.